My name is Rebecca Hayes. I'm 35 years old. And the day that shattered everything wasn't when I pulled 13 hostages out of a collapsing building in Kandahar, or when shrapnel from an IED left scars across my back that still ache in winter. It was sitting in Riverside Funeral Home, listening to my own family destroy me at my father's service. 5 years she's been gone, Aunt Carol whispered, her voice cutting through the organ music like a blade. Never calls, never visits. What kind of daughter abandons her dying father? The murmur of agreement rippled through the pews like poison. 60 relatives who should have known better, nodding along as they catalogued my failures. I sat in the back row wearing my only black dress, hands folded to hide the trembling, carrying secrets that would keep them awake for months. Probably living in some trailer park, my cousin Jake muttered. Dad always said she'd amount to nothing. They thought they knew who I was. They thought my absence meant abandonment. They had no idea I'd been saving lives they'd never know were in danger. The funeral home smelled like lilies and regret. White roses cascaded over Dad's mahogany casket, while 60 relatives filled the burgundy pews of Riverside Chapel, their whispers echoing off polished marble like prayers nobody wanted to hear. I sat in the back row, alone, not by accident, by design. 3 generations of Hayes family had arranged themselves in perfect order. Mom in the front with Uncle Paul, my successful cousins in the second row, the accomplished aunts and uncles behind them. And then there was me, the black sheep relegated to funeral home purgatory, wearing a wrinkled dress I'd bought at Target during my layover in Denver. 5 years. That's how long it had been since I'd sat in this room, watching these same faces measure my worth and find it wanting. Nothing had changed except the lines around their eyes and the certainty in their judgment. She looks terrible, Aunt Martha whispered to Cousin Sarah, her voice carrying clearly across the chapel's hushed atmosphere. 5 years and she's got nothing to show for it. Nothing to show for it. The words hit like shrapnel, finding every vulnerable spot I'd thought I'd armored against their opinion. While they'd been building their suburban empires, corner offices, and country club memberships, I'd been building something they couldn't measure in salary figures or social media posts. Never married, no kids, Sarah murmured back, her voice thick with pity that felt more like acid. What's she even been doing all this time? What had I been doing? 3 months ago, I'd been crouched in a bombed-out building in Damascus, cradling a wounded Marine while bullets tore chunks out of the concrete around us. 2 weeks before that, I'd led a team through a terrorist compound at 0300 hours, extracting 13 hostages who'd been held for 8 months. But there was no way to explain that at a funeral in upstate New York. No way to tell them that their failure of a niece held clearances that would make most federal employees jealous, that she'd been personally decorated by generals whose names appeared in history books. Remember when she was in ROTC? Uncle Paul's voice carried from the third row, tinged with that particular brand of disappointment that had followed me since high school. We all thought she'd grow out of it. Thought she'd settle down, start a real life. A real life. I remembered being 17, standing at attention in my crisp uniform while Dad rolled his eyes and muttered about his daughter playing soldier. I'd graduated summa cum laude from West Point, but he'd skipped the ceremony because it fell on the same weekend as my cousin's wedding shower. The thing about Rebecca, my brother's wife Amanda chimed in, her voice carrying that tone of concerned expertise she'd perfected during her years as a suburban mom, is that she never learned to compromise. Never figured out that sometimes you have to give up your fantasies to build something real. Fantasies, real. The cognitive dissonance was breathtaking. While Amanda had been managing soccer schedules and PTA meetings, I'd been managing crisis situations that could have destabilized entire regions. While she'd been compromising on kitchen backsplashes, I'd been making life and death decisions that affected international security. My brother Michael stood near the casket, accepting condolences with the gravity of a man who'd built something worth mourning. At 37, he commanded respect in every room he entered, CEO of his own consulting firm, house in Westchester, kids in private school, everything Dad had dreamed of in a son. Michael's really stepping up, I heard Cousin Daniel say to his wife. Taking care of all the arrangements, handling Mom's finances. Thank God someone in the family has their life together. The implication hung in the air like incense smoke. Michael had his life together. Rebecca, The 35-year-old question mark remained a cautionary tale about what happened when you refused to follow the approved script for success. I gripped my folded hands tighter, feeling the calluses from rappelling ropes and rifle grips, evidence of a life lived at the sharp edge of purpose that meant nothing to people who measured worth in mortgage payments and quarterly earnings. The memory hit me like incoming artillery fire. Age 12. Watching Dad teach Michael how to change the oil in his pickup truck, while I stood on the sidelines holding the socket wrench he'd never offered to teach me to use. "This is man's work, sweetheart," he'd said when I'd asked to try. "Why don't you go help your mother with dinner?" Even then, I'd stared at those tools and wondered when I'd be trusted with something more substantial than setting tables and folding laundry. Now, 23 years later, I'd mastered weapon systems that most men couldn't pronounce, but to them, I was still the girl who'd never learned when to give up her childish dreams. 5 years she's been gone, Aunt Carol announced to anyone within earshot, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never been wrong about family dynamics. 5 years without a phone call, a visit, a single sign that she cared about her own father. 5 years without contact because operational security demanded radio silence. 5 years of letters I'd written but couldn't send, phone calls I'd planned but couldn't make. Because the work required absolute commitment to a cover that even my own family had to believe. "Probably living in some ratty apartment somewhere," Jake muttered, loud enough for half the chapel to hear. Dad always said she'd end up broke and alone. Broke and alone. The phrase would have been funny if it didn't cut so deep. My military salary was modest, but I'd saved lives that would never appear on any balance sheet. I'd prevented terrorist attacks that would have dominated headlines for decades. I'd walked into hell repeatedly and brought other people's children home safely. But none of that registered on their scorecards of success. "Some people never grow up," Uncle Paul added with the certainty of someone who'd confused stability with accomplishment, still playing Army while the rest of us built real careers. Playing Army. While he'd been selling insurance and attending Rotary Club meetings, I'd been conducting operations that would remain classified for the next 50 years. While he'd been worrying about quarterly sales figures, I'd been preventing international incidents that could have started wars. The cruel irony was suffocating. They'd spent my entire life telling me to grow up, to be realistic, to stop chasing fantasies. But their realistic world only existed because people like me were willing to live in the shadows, to sacrifice everything normal and safe and comfortable so they could sleep peacefully in their suburban beds. And now, sitting in this chapel filled with the scent of funeral flowers and family disappointment, I realized that the silence I'd maintained to protect operational security had become the very evidence they used to convict me of failure. They thought my absence meant abandonment. They interpreted my silence as indifference. They'd constructed an entire narrative about my worthless life based on the cover story I'd been required to maintain. But underneath their disappointment, I carried secrets that would change everything if I could ever tell them. Tomorrow, that silence would finally be broken. Tonight, I was just Rebecca, the daughter who'd failed to meet expectations, sitting alone at her father's funeral while her family cataloged her shortcomings. But the truth was coming. And when it arrived, everything they thought they knew about failure and success would shatter like glass under pressure. The funeral director was midway through his prepared remarks about Dad's life 30 years at the electric company. Devoted husband, proud father when the first rumble cut through his practiced eulogy like thunder rolling across summer sky. Everyone heard it. 60 heads turned toward the stained glass windows as headlights swept across the chapel walls, casting moving shadows that danced between the lilies and funeral wreaths. The low, unmistakable growl of diesel engines grew louder, closer, until it seemed to shake the very foundation of Riverside Funeral Home. "What in God's name?" Uncle Paul muttered, craning his neck toward the parking lot where the sound was building to a crescendo that made conversation impossible. Through the amber glass, we could see them, a convoy of black vehicles moving with military precision down Elm Street. SUVs with government plates, armored trucks that belonged on battlefields, not in suburban funeral processions. The kind of official presence that turns ordinary Tuesday afternoons into something that gets remembered for decades. The funeral director's voice faltered, his prepared words forgotten as every mourner in that chapel strained to see what was happening outside. Mom gripped the armrest of her front row chair, her knuckles white against the burgundy fabric. Michael stepped away from the casket, his CEO confidence replaced by confusion that mirrored everyone else's. That's when the doors opened. Not the gentle, respectful opening of latecomers slipping in during a service. The heavy oak doors of Riverside Chapel swung wide, with the authority of people who weren't asking permission, who didn't need to whisper apologies for their interruption. The first soldier through the doorway was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing dress blues that fit like they'd been tailored on his body. His boots struck the marble floor with the kind of precision that comes from 1,000 parade drills, each step echoing through the stunned silence like a drumbeat. Behind him came 12 more. 13 total, all in full military dress uniform, their ribbons and medals catching the afternoon light streaming through the windows. They moved like a single organism, synchronized and purposeful, filling the chapel's center aisle with a presence that transformed the entire atmosphere. I recognized the formation immediately. Honor Guard detail, the kind reserved for heroes, for ceremonies that matter, for moments when the military wants to make a statement that can't be ignored or forgotten. But why here? Why now? Why at a funeral for an electrician in upstate New York? The lead soldier, I could see the oak leaves on his collar. Lieutenant Colonel stepped forward until he was standing directly in front of Dad's flag-draped casket. His voice, when he spoke, carried clearly to every corner of that chapel. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his words cutting through the silence like a blade through silk, "we are here to honor Captain Rebecca Hayes." Captain Rebecca Hayes. The name hung in the air like smoke after gunfire. I felt every eye in that room turn toward me, 60 faces swiveling in unison to stare at the woman they'd spent the last hour dismissing as a failure. Aunt Martha's mouth fell open. Cousin Sarah's hand flew to her chest like she'd been struck. Jake's smirk evaporated so completely it might never have existed. Captain Hayes, the lieutenant colonel continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, led Operation Desert Rescue 3 months ago. A mission that resulted in the successful extraction of 13 American hostages who had been held by terrorist forces for 8 months. 13 hostages. The number hit that funeral home like a physical force, rippling through the crowd in waves of shock and disbelief. I watched my family's faces as they struggled to process what they were hearing. Not security guard, not wasting her life. Captain, operation. Hostages, terrorists. During the operation, the lieutenant colonel's voice rose to fill every corner of the chapel. Captain Hayes personally led her team through hostile territory under enemy fire, coordinating air support and ground forces to execute a flawless extraction that saved American lives. The soldier to his right stepped forward, holding a wooden display case that gleamed under the funeral home's soft lighting. Through the glass, I could see the unmistakable bronze star of a military decoration, its ribbon pristine against white satin. The Bronze Star Medal, the lieutenant colonel announced, awarded for heroic achievement in ground combat against an armed enemy. Captain Hayes, would you please step forward? Step forward. In front of 60 relatives who thought they knew exactly who I was and what I'd accomplished with my life. In front of a family that had spent 35 years waiting for me to become something worth acknowledging, I stood slowly, feeling every muscle in my legs protest the movement. Not from fear, but from the weight of vindication that had been building for 5 years of silence, 5 years of carrying secrets that could have shattered their assumptions if I'd been allowed to share them. As I walked down that center aisle, the same aisle I'd avoided walking down at my cousin's wedding because I had no accomplishments worth celebrating, 13 soldiers came to attention with a precision that made the air itself seem to snap. The bronze star felt heavier than its actual weight as the lieutenant colonel pinned it to my black dress. Around me, I could hear the sound of 60 people trying to process a reality that contradicted everything they'd believed about their family's black sheep. Furthermore, the lieutenant colonel continued, his voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence, Captain Hayes has been selected for promotion to major, effective immediately, in recognition of her exceptional service and leadership under extreme conditions. Major. The word echoed through that funeral home like cannon fire. I looked at my mother in the front row, saw tears streaming down her face as she stared at a daughter she'd thought she knew, saw Uncle Paul gripping his program so tightly the paper was crumpling in his hands, saw Aunt Martha whispering prayers or apologies or both. The United States Army, the lieutenant colonel said, his final words carrying the weight of absolute authority, salutes Major Rebecca Hayes for her service, sacrifice, and courage in defense of American lives and values. 13 soldiers raised their hands in perfect unison. 13 salutes held with parade ground precision, honoring the woman who'd sat in the back row being dismissed as a disappointment just 20 minutes earlier. The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Not the respectful quiet of a funeral service, but the thunderous silence of assumptions shattering, of carefully constructed narratives collapsing under the weight of truth. I stood there in my wrinkled target dress, wearing a bronze star that most soldiers serve entire careers without earning, surrounded by the honor guard of a grateful nation, while my family struggled to reconcile the hero they were seeing with the failure they'd spent decades creating in their minds. 5 years of secrets, 5 years of silence, 5 years of letting them believe I was wasting my life while I was actually saving others. And now, finally, the truth was no longer mine alone to carry. The silence that followed the soldier's salute was deafening. 13 hands held at perfect attention, 13 sets of eyes fixed on the woman who'd spent 35 years being told she wasn't quite enough. The bronze star pinned to my dress caught the funeral home's soft lighting, casting tiny rainbows across the mahogany casket that held my father's body. Then Mom broke. Not the quiet tears of grief I'd watched her shed for 3 days, but something deeper, rawer, the kind of crying that comes when you realize you've been catastrophically wrong about someone you thought you knew. She rose from the front pew like her legs could barely hold her, stumbling toward me with her face streaked in mascara and regret. "Rebecca," she whispered, her voice cracking on my name like breaking glass. "Oh God, Rebecca, I'm so sorry." When she reached me, she collapsed into my arms with the weight of 1,000 apologies she'd never thought she'd need to give. Her body shook against mine, and I could feel 35 years of misunderstanding dissolving in the space between heartbeats. "I'm so sorry," she sobbed into my shoulder, her words muffled against the fabric of my dress. "You were never a burden. Never. You are your father's greatest pride. His greatest pride." The irony hit me like incoming artillery fire. Dad's greatest pride, spoken over his casket, witnessed by 13 soldiers who'd traveled 300 miles to honor his daughter's service. The validation I'd craved my entire life, delivered at the moment when it no longer mattered to the man who'd withheld it. Around us, the transformation was immediate and complete. Uncle Paul's face had gone white as bone, his earlier confidence evaporated like morning mist. Aunt Martha clutched her purse with trembling hands, staring at me like I was someone she'd never seen before. Cousin Daniel's smirk had been replaced by something closer to horror, the look of a man realizing he'd spent years mocking a genuine hero. But it was Jake's reaction that cut deepest. My cousin, who'd spent the afternoon explaining why I'd never amount to anything, was now staring at the bronze star on my chest like it was evidence of his own moral bankruptcy. His mouth moved soundlessly, forming words he couldn't bring himself to speak. The ripples started in the back rows. Mrs. Patterson from 3 houses down rose slowly from her seat, her arthritis-gnarled hands coming together in hesitant applause. The sound was tentative at first, uncertain, like the first drops of rain before a storm. Then Mr. Kowalski joined her. Then the Hendersons from across the street. One by one, neighbors who'd watched me grow up, who'd heard the family gossip about my failures, who'd assumed the worst about my 5-year absence, rose to their feet in recognition of something they'd never imagined. The applause built like thunder rolling across mountains, swelling until it filled every corner of Riverside Chapel. Not polite funeral home clapping, but the kind of ovation usually reserved for heroes returning from war. Which, I realized with crystalline clarity, was exactly what this was. Through the sound, I could see my family's faces. Relatives who'd spent decades cataloging my failures were now confronting the reality that their black sheep had been serving her country with distinction while they'd been writing her off as a disappointment. The lieutenant colonel stepped forward one final time, his voice cutting through the applause with military precision. "Major Hayes," he said, and the new rank felt like vindication wrapped in brass and ribbon. "Your father would have been proud. Your father would have been proud." The words I'd waited 35 years to hear, spoken by a stranger in dress blues, while the man who should have said them lay silent in a flag-draped casket 10 feet away. But as I stood there, my mother's arms still wrapped around me, 13 soldiers at attention, 60 relatives processing the magnitude of their mistake, I realized something that changed everything. I didn't need Dad's pride anymore. I'd stopped needing it somewhere between my first deployment and the moment I'd pulled that terrified hostage out of a terrorist compound. My worth wasn't determined by his ability to understand it. It was proven every time I'd put myself between predators and innocent people. The applause began to fade, but not the recognition in people's eyes. For the first time in my life, I was being seen for who I actually was, instead of who they'd assumed I'd failed to become. All my life, I said quietly, my voice somehow carrying clearly through the settling quiet, I carried secrets heavier than any burden you could imagine. I fought battles in deserts you can't pronounce, only to come home and fight another battle in the pews of my own family. Mom pulled back to look at my face, her eyes red but filled with something I'd never seen directed at me before: respect. I couldn't tell you where I was or what I was doing, I continued, looking around the chapel at faces that had spent decades dismissing me. Lives depended on that silence. Operations required that level of secrecy. But that silence became the very evidence you used to convict me of failure. Uncle Paul found his voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. We had no idea, Rebecca, we thought. You thought wrong, I said, not unkindly, but with the firmness that comes from 15 years of making hard truths clear to people who didn't want to hear them. You assumed that because my work wasn't visible, wasn't something you could brag about at dinner parties, it wasn't important. The 13 soldiers began filing out then, their mission complete, leaving behind a chapel transformed by truth. As their boots echoed across the marble floor, I understood that I was watching the end of one version of my story and the beginning of another. The woman they'd dismissed as a burden had been revealed as someone who'd carried burdens they couldn't imagine. The daughter they'd written off as a failure had been decorated for preventing failures that would have dominated headlines for decades. I looked at Dad's casket one last time, draped in the same flag I'd sworn to defend. He'd never lived to see me vindicated, never know that his disappointment of a daughter had become exactly the kind of person he'd tried to raise his son to be. But the 13 soldiers who'd saluted me knew. The Bronze Star pinned to my dress knew. The hostages sleeping safely in their beds tonight knew. And finally, after 35 years of carrying their doubts like shrapnel in my chest, that was all the validation I'd ever need. The truth had marched in on its own, wearing dress blues and speaking with the authority of a grateful nation. For the first time in my life, I was seen not as a burden or a failure, but as exactly who I'd always been. Major Rebecca Hayes, hero, daughter. The woman who'd walked into darkness so others could live in the light. Rebecca's story reminds us that worth isn't measured by family approval, that heroism often works in silence, and that the most powerful validation comes from serving something bigger than yourself. We all know someone who's been underestimated, overlooked, or made to feel invisible by the people who should see their value. Maybe it's you. Maybe it's someone sitting next to you right now. Here's what you can do. Share your story. Drop a comment below about a time when people completely misjudged your work, your dreams, or your worth. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is remind someone that their value isn't determined by other people's limited vision. Honor the unsung heroes. Tag someone in your life who serves quietly, works without recognition, or sacrifices for others while getting no credit. Military members, first responders, teachers, caregivers, social workers, the people who make our safe, comfortable lives possible while we're busy measuring success in salary figures and social media likes. Stop waiting for permission to matter. If you're living your life waiting for someone else's approval, this is your wake-up call. Your worth doesn't depend on other people's ability to understand it. Do the work that matters to you. Serve something bigger than yourself. Let your actions speak louder than their doubts. Follow for more untold stories. Hit that subscribe button if you want to hear more stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things in silence. The heroes among us don't always wear uniforms or carry medals. Sometimes they're sitting in the corner chair at family gatherings, carrying secrets that would change everything if the truth could be told. The real question is, what would your family discover about you if the truth marched through the front door tomorrow? Share this story. Someone needs to hear it today.